Well, let's start with your reactions to the Trump administration's national security statement. Now, Kishore, you've been critical of US policy towards China in recent times, but many commentators, and I think of The Guardian on the left and the Wall Street Journal on the right, they say the remarks on China were milder than predicted. So in your judgment, Kishore, has the Trump administration got the right tone with respect to China?
Well, I think, to judge the Trump administration, you can look at the words of the national security strategy. But, as someone who's been involved in diplomacy and watching international relations only for 55 years, I can tell you at the end of the day, the words don't matter, the deeds do. And you got to look at the actual policies and actions of the Trump administration towards China. And there's no doubt that overall, the Trump administration is behaving much more realistically and pragmatically towards China than, say, the previous Biden administration was, which was actually had a very strong ideological bent when it came to China. And I think this realistic, pragmatic attitude of Trump, by the way, after a few punch-ups, the Trump administration did raise tariffs on China to 145%. Okay, so I mean there were punch-ups along the way, but at the end of the day, they seem to have settled into a groove where they've decided that both sides have to learn to live with each other. And here, I think the most important development in U.S.-China relations is that probably for the first time since the Opium War of 1842, China was able to retaliate against a great power by, its restrictions on rare earths and telling them, you can no longer push me around. So the whole balance has changed in the U.S.-China relationship. I think it'll take some time for both the United States and China to adjust to this relationship, but I would give President Trump some credit for at least trying to approach it in a realistic, pragmatic way without any ideological bias. Okay,
but the national security statement still identifies China as a greater threat than Russia. It places less strategic emphasis on Europe, and it's determined for America not to be drawn into more Middle East conflicts. John, that sounds a lot like the John Mearsheimer grand strategy that you've espoused in recent decades. Now, you've been very critical of Trump's foreign policy, but in fairness, hasn't this administration at least got a better strategic sense than its Democratic and Republican predecessors, whose policies led to debacles such as the forever wars with which both you and Kishore opposed? John?
Well, as Kishore pointed out, there is a fundamental difference between actual policy and what is written down on paper. And I think if you look at the national security strategy, this new document that's been issued, I like it a lot, at least the basic framework in the document, because it does reflect on my views on what U.S. grand strategy should be. But in terms of actual policy, I think there's a real disjuncture between what the Trump administration has done and what is said in those pages of the national security strategy. And if you look at what President Trump has done, he's really messed up on China. As Kishore was alluding to, he started off by playing hardball with the Chinese, thinking he could push the Chinese around. And the Chinese quickly reminded him that they had cards to play and they could make life miserable for the Americans. So he had to back off. I think you could make an argument that he's been humiliated by the Chinese. Furthermore, he's got us into this mess in Venezuela, which I don't see how he gets out of. He went to war against the Houthis this past summer, promising that he was going to win a decisive victory very quickly. After 1 month, he quit, admitted the Houthis were tough hombres and he couldn't beat them. He went to war against Iran with the Israelis. They claimed it was a great success at the time, but if it's such a great success, why are they talking about attacking Iran again? Furthermore, Trump, like Biden, is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. He makes all these claims about shutting down this war and that war. If you look closely at what he's done no such thing. And the best evidence of that is the Ukraine war. He said he was going to shut it down before he entered the White House, and if not then, shortly after he got into the White House. He's failed to shut down the war in Ukraine. It goes on and on. So if you look at his policy performance, it is a pretty negative assessment is due on it. And I don't think it reflects the more balanced view of how to deal with the world that's found in the national security strategy document.
Yeah, but if you look, I mean, I'll just push back gently, John. I mean, many people would say that Iran, you know, America's strategic nemesis in the Persian Gulf since the 1979 revolution, Iran's on the back foot. Its Shia crescent has been really diminished. You think about those Shia militias, Hezbollah in Syria, it's greatly weakened. The US maintains very good relations with the Saudis and the Sunni Gulf states. And, you know, even with respect to China, the Trump administration has just presided over a record arms deal to Taiwan. That's worth more than $11 billion. You'd support that. And of course, here in this document, the Trump administration's trying to make it clear that they want to place less emphasis on Europe. You'd agree with that too, wouldn't you, John?
No, there's no question that if you look at the document, how Trump talks about dealing with China is fine by me. And the fact that they've given $11.1 billion to Taiwan is fine by me. So I'm not criticizing that. What I was criticizing was the fact that early in his administration, he decided he was going to play hardball with the Chinese. And the Chinese told him, you're not playing hardball with us, because if we play hardball with you, we'll win in that competition. And the fact is the Chinese beat him. He backed off. He clearly backed off. And with regard to the Middle East, Hezbollah is alive. It's well armed, and it's not going away. Hamas has not been defeated. It's not going away. And again, I would remind you that Trump is complicit in a genocide, which according to most people in the world is the greatest of all crimes. And with regard to Iran, if it was such a great success, why are they talking about attacking Iran again? Because it wasn't such a great success. And the idea that they shut down the nuclear enrichment program in Iran forever is a myth. That's not true at all. They didn't solve that problem. The only problem they solved was Syria. And over the long term, we'll see how well that works out.
Well, both you and Keyshaw would agree with this statement in the National Security Statement, quote, that the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. And Keyshaw, Trump has attracted some unlikely supporters. Here's the former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating. This is the quote: Trump all by himself is employing his mandate to alter America's post-war strategic direction to both acknowledge and accommodate other great powers in a manner last comprehensively articulated by Franklin Roosevelt. Trump has one virtue and one virtue alone. He may prevent a World War III. Keyshaw, your response to the former Australian Prime Minister?
Well, first of all, I must commend him for his courage, okay? Especially in the Western media, for any Western leader, current or past, to praise Trump, you get attacked viciously if you say anything positive about Trump. So Paul Keating took a lot of courage for him to say that. And I would also agree with him on one thing, that vis-a-vis the other nuclear powers, Trump understands that you're playing with fire if you push around the other nuclear powers in the war situation. I mean, you can impose trade sanctions, that's fine. Trade sanctions are not going to lead to war. But he's and that's why you notice that on even though he hasn't succeeded yet in achieving a peace deal in Ukraine, I can tell you that the Europeans are absolutely terrified by what Trump is trying to do, which is trying to reach some kind of understanding with Russia, some kind of agreement to say at the end of the day, this war has to end. Now, he's of course discovering, as John highlighted, that it is never easy to switch off a war that's been going on for a couple of years. It takes a lot of hard work and things. But at the same time, I thought that by now, with so much European resistance and European lobbying and European, to quote Susan Glasser, the European strategy of strategic self-abasement, kowtowing to Trump, that they might be able to nudge him away from his efforts to try and stop the war in Ukraine. He hasn't stopped doing it. He hasn't stopped trying, okay? He hasn't succeeded, but he hasn't stopped trying. And the fact that he's handling the nuclear, especially the major nuclear powers, China and Russia, very carefully. I think when future historians look at Donald Trump, I suspect that the biggest positive tribute they would give to him is that he sort of recognizes that the era of the Western domination of world history is over, and the United States and the West has got to learn to live with people who are very different, and you don't try and change their societies. So, for example, categorically, he said on Saudi Arabia, it's not our mission to change Saudi Arabia's political system, right? That's something that no other previous administration would say. They would say, "Oh no, we must push our values," and so on and so forth. But just by saying that it is not our mission to push values, Western values, down the throats of other countries, we just have to accept that they have different societies and to live with them. That's a significant turn from all previous American administrations.
And especially when it comes to China, Kishore mentions Trump's instinctive desire for realism and pragmatism when it comes to relations with Beijing. Is all this why America will allow NVIDIA to sell one of its more advanced chips to China? This is the Economist magazine just in the last week. They say this shows that the administration is ready to sacrifice some of its technological edge over China in exchange for goodwill. So is this a sign that America is buckling to China, John?
Well, the fact is that Trump got into a trade war with the Chinese, as I emphasized before. And he thought that he held the upper hand, and it turned out that he did not have the upper hand. And he's been forced to make compromises. And this is one of the compromises that he's been forced to make. The Chinese have been playing hardball with him. They started on April 4th when they made it clear that they were going to curtail the flow of rare earths, and especially rare earth magnets, into the United States. And then on October 2nd, the Chinese explicitly upped the ante. And this was a huge problem for the Trump administration. And furthermore, as you know, Trump depends heavily on support from farmers. And the Chinese said they were going to stop importing American soybeans. And this was a huge problem. So what's happening here is that Trump, on the trade front, is being forced to make certain concessions. And with regard to the H200 chip that he's now agreed to sell to China, you see evidence of the extent to which he's been forced to back off. And by the way, I'll give you another example that I think is an important one, is where he didn't really stand up and back the
and so on and so forth. So are we downplaying the China threat here, Kishore?
Well, by the way, you're absolutely right in your first statement that countries in the region want to see the United States stay engaged in the region. You're right. Not just for the reason you mentioned of deterring China, but also many countries in the region have had very, very long-standing relationships with the United States. And as you know, in Southeast Asia and the ASEAN region, there are huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States. But that said, I would say the story is much more complicated than the one you present, that the countries in the region were looking for United States as an insurance against China. And the reason why the story is much more complicated than the way you portray it is that there are over 50 states in Asia. And you mentioned 5. And you're right. You mentioned 4 states and 1 Taiwan. So if you look overall, there's no question that China's relations with the majority of states in Asia is on a very positive track. And all you have to do is look at the statements that are coming out from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Bangladesh. You can get a sense of how states around the region are coming to terms with the fact that China is emerging as a new great power. And by the way, this is 2,000 years of history.
Yeah.
When a great power emerges in your neighborhood, okay, the wisest thing you have to do is to adjust to the fact that a new great power has arrived in your neighborhood. And this is where, frankly, the pragmatism of the Asian states overall is a big asset. We're not choosing sides. We're not saying we're going to be with United States against China. We're not saying we're going to be with China against United States. We say, no, we're going to be friends with both of you. And we're going to live with both of you. And that I think is the dominant strain. Now, when you mention the specific cases, I frankly think that it was a huge mistake for the Japanese Prime Minister to make a pronouncement about Taiwan, because at the end of the day, the Chinese, one of the things that China wants to do is to remove all traces of the century of humiliation. And one of the lowest points of the century of humiliation was when Japan seized Taiwan from China after winning the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So that being such a sore point in the China-Japan relations, it was an absolute mistake for the Japanese Prime Minister to say things in the way that she did so. And by the way, John is right. President Trump didn't support Japan when she made that statement. So I would emphasize to you, the key point is don't push things into a binary black and white choices. The story is very complex, and countries have very complex relationships with China and with the United States.
Yeah, well, John, Kishore says that China's rise and the region's reaction to its rise is more complicated than what I portray.